This is JoJo with AAICM for Outer Experiences. I'm with Clark Sanders. Mr. Sanders, what year were you born?
I was born in 1956.
All right. And where were you born?
Decatur, Illinois.
Okay. And then where are you currently recording this interview? Are you at your home in Plymouth?
Yes, Plymouth, Minnesota.
Okay. And then what prompted you to move to Minnesota?
To put it as succinctly as possible, I was tricked into coming here.
Okay. Tricked how so?
Well, when I was in high school and my junior year back in Decatur, I received a letter from a school in Minnesota, and I looked at a map, saw Minnesota, Canada,
Mm-hmm.
Alaska, and told myself at that point in my life, that is a place that I will never live in.
Mm-hmm.
Bottom line, there's no doubt, no question. As a matter of fact, after I graduated high school, I went to the Ohio State University for a year and transferred from OSU to Mizzou. So the University of Missouri in Columbia, which was several hours closer to Decatur. And after finishing in Missouri, my wife at that point in time said that there were industrial organizational psychology postgraduate studies that could be done in two different schools that were both very good in IO Psych, which was something that I had studied for. And one was Ohio State, and the other one was the University of Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
And I had already been to Ohio, and I understood what life was like in Columbus, and I had decided, well, that wasn't exactly a direction I would want to take. So
Mm-hmm.
we ended up coming here to Minnesota, and that gave me an opportunity to find out what Minnesota was like and to find out what divorce was like. So
Oh
being
no.
here, oh yes,
Yeah.
meant that I could leave here as far as I was concerned because now I was divorced and single, except that I had two major reasons why I couldn't leave.
Mm-hmm.
Children.
Yeah.
That was in 79, and 1979, that meant that I had to make a choice about how it was I was going to live my life in Minnesota. So there was a gentleman in Missouri, in Columbia, that was known as the Burger King, and he said, you can learn about business in short order if you go into fast food management.
Mm-hmm.
And I had wanted to switch my degree focus in college from psychology to business. And they said, you can, my advisor did, but you'll have to start all over.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided I'd finish out in psychology and try to marry it with business. And that's where the industrial organizational psychology came in.
Okay.
So after being here for several years and after being in that portion of business, doing fast food and quick food management, I wound up getting into another form of business in sales and moving in a different direction and realized that I was actually, excuse me, I was
Mm-hmm.
actually avoiding something that I was meant to do, and that was to be an educator.
Mm-hmm. How did you come to that realization?
I had, when I was 8 years old, consulted the Bible, sat it in front of me, and said, basically, show me my path.
Mhm.
And I opened the Bible, and right there in front of me, now, I mean opened it randomly, it said, I am known as Ecclesiastes, for I am teacher. And I slammed the Bible shut and said, no, 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 no.
Mhm.
So it basically wound up being a path that was selected, as far as I was concerned, by divine intervention.
Mhm.
So I immediately avoided it. I didn't want to have any part of it. That would have been when I was in third grade, and already by that point in time, I had deemed school as something that was not the best of ideas for me. And a year later, about the time that I was 9, I met one of the most beautiful people in my life, and that was my aunt, my father's sister. And
Mhm.
I gathered from her visit to Decatur from Oklahoma that she was a teacher. My
Mhm.
goodness, there's something so regal, something that is so knowing about her. This is somebody and it's, being a black person, a black woman, I never seen anyone like this.
Mhm.
So I didn't consider at the time that she had gone through Brown versus Board of Education.
Right.
And when I say go through, there's a lot of people who don't realize or recognize that there was many sides to that decision. But one of the sides that people don't talk about, that's not taught about, of course, what is definitely spoken out about is how it was supposed to eliminate segregation. And
Mhm.
that part is supposed to make the big difference in how it is that we're educated in the United States. So what isn't discussed is who was against that particular uh, decision by the Supreme Court. And it was, well, dark people who were in positions in education. What would become of their jobs? What would become of all those different schools and all the different staff that had jobs that were dark educators in a dark educational system who were
Mhm.
teaching dark children? And of
Right.
course, they couldn't teach white children. So
Mhm.
those jobs were eliminated. So if there were a few of them that were left, and there was a possible chance that someone could hang on to their schools, those folks did that. For the most part, by and large, you're going to wind up having people who were unemployed, administrators, teaching staff, all the support staff that was a part of the schools, everything that had to do with maintaining those buildings, even though they were considered to be horrible places for people to go to school,
Mhm.
all those people disappeared.
Right.
And all the dark children went to white schools, and that's why it is that in this day and age, we've got only about 10% of the educational population as far as teachers are concerned in the United States are teachers of color.
Mhm.
So it flipped drastically, and no one talked about it, so no one talks about it. So this was something that I had to deal with as I was coming up through the ranks and trying to figure out what to do as a next step with my life to not just be employed, but to make a difference, being a
Mhm.
change agent. And I looked at my 2 children that I wouldn't leave the state for, and I had to wonder, why are these 2, who I know to be incredibly bright people, seemingly coming home year after year, not as thoughtful, not as curious, not as having as much depth as they had the year before, and what it is they wanted to know about their lives and the world around them.
Mhm.
So
Do you think that had
I,
anything to do? Sorry. Do
with
you think that had
with the
anything to do
schooling
with
aspect,
yeah, and living in
I
Minnesota
didn't know
maybe?
for sure, and being that I had or have a psych background, that meant that I had to do some studying. I had to do
Mhm.
research. I had to try, and that basically was a question. Is the fact that my children are not who they were going into this formal education that is standard in our society, was that a reason why they weren't who they were only basically a shadow, it seemed, of themselves?
Mhm.
So I had gone into different types of instruction. At first it was by working in health clubs and getting different certification as a health club instructor.
Mhm.
And it became kind of obvious to me I could teach and very likely should teach. So my current wife looked at me and said, why don't you become a teacher? I
Mhm.
had avoided it for 10 years out of college, found that there was a means of getting a teacher's license in Minnesota, and that would have been through St. Cloud by going to St. Cloud and doing my studies there to get my
Mhm.
teacher's licensure. And she came across another bit of information while she was at work that mentioned alternative for licensure,
Mhm.
which meant that I would get a stipend. I would get partially paid to learn to become a teacher. And it was through a collaboration between St. Cloud State and Anoka Hennepin School District.
Mhm.
So I decided I'd sign up for that, and we'd run pretty lean because it was going to be a matter of me continuing my instruction in health clubs and even doing some sales in health clubs. And so taking a transferable skill that I had learned before even getting into the idea of moving towards education and sales
Mhm.
and finding what I could do to become a teacher. Well, I had an interview, a phone interview, to ask about this particular program that they had in place. And as I was talking with the person on the phone, she would ask a question, I would answer the question, and she'd say, if you qualify, and I would just say, okay. And I'd ask my next question. And
Mhm.
I knew exactly what she meant by if you qualify because they were looking for teachers of color
Mhm.
and they were looking for folks who wanted to go into special ed
Okay.
that didn't necessarily have to be teachers of color. They just needed special ed teachers at that point.
Mhm.
So she basically couldn't figure out by my voice, by my inflection, if
Mhm.
I was black or not.
Right.
So I went ahead and got into that particular system, went through the Alternative for Licensure program, did my one semester of work in middle school. At that time, I believe it was junior high, because this
Mhm.
was back in '91.
Okay.
And I did my high school portion at a place that I had joked about with friends of mine back in Illinois
Mhm.
called Coon Rapids.
Right. Mhm.
And they laughed and said there's no such place. And I had to help them understand, yes, this is a
Yeah.
town. in the Twin Cities, and
Mhm.
it's Coon Rapids, and they call the junior high school Coon June, and I
Wow.
was like, where the heck am I? So in '82, in that same part of the state, in Coon Rapids, someone had lit a cross on a lawn to burn in a Jewish person's property. And I was trying my best to piece it together. It's like, this is a suburban town in the Twin Cities that are noted as being progressive for the most part about how it is that people are dealt with. And they're burning crosses.
Mhm.
And so I was curious about this place called Coon Rapids and ended up teaching students there who were quite receptive to my being in the building.
Mhm.
And I thought, my goodness, they're hungry for a difference. The status quo isn't exactly doing it for them. And my introduction to education was at the high school level, was from a gentleman who was retiring that year. And he said to me, his first words, it's all about survival. This from a seasoned, experienced educator who had also coached, that worked at the high school level. And I had immediately to think there's got to be more to it than that.
Right.
It's all about survival. And as I was entering into concern, I was wondering if that meant teachers' survival or student survival.
Mhm.
And I came to find out it meant both, but more so for students of color
Mhm.
in a formal education system.
Mhm.
And obviously we need more than to just survive. And that's actually the title to a book that a black doctor who had written that has to do with dark students going through the educational system. Dr. Batima Love. I met her, and I had to make certain that I shook her hand and have her know I read her book in a day because it was so intriguing to me. And she's surprised by that.
Mhm.
And I talked with her about a theory that I have that's called the separation anxiety theory. And she said, don't talk with too many people about it. Write it and then discuss
Yeah.
it.
Mhm.
So I have a theory of mine that deals with this idea of having dark students go through a formal education system.
Mhm.
I'll
You
leave
said
that as
something
a teaser.
really, yeah. You said something really interesting at the beginning, when you were thinking about where to go to college, and Minnesota was maybe one of the places, and you said definitely not, because you looked at it was next to Canada. You said Alaska. Was there an image of Minnesota you had before that made you hesitant to even consider coming here?
Well, at first it was, to me, obvious that it was cold,
Hmm.
physically cold.
Yeah.
And being in central Illinois, the weather, the temperature is about 20 degrees warmer than here. So whatever the temperature is here, it's at least 20 degrees warmer there. The winters are damp. They were cold. They were freeze you to the bone kind of temperatures. Again, we're not talking about Chicago. We're not talking about one of the Great Lakes cities. We're talking about a place that is in the center part of the state. If you wanted to blow up Illinois, You drop a bomb on Decatur and it would spread north and south to be able to get to the state. It's in a depression, a physical depression in the earth. So there's a low point there. And I was used to an Illinois type of cold.
Mm-hmm.
And even in Ohio, the cold was different to me. It wasn't the same as an Illinois cold, but it was still more Midwestern cold.
Mm-hmm.
Missouri, the cold was understandable to me. And even in the Midwest, in those parts, it was more a matter of a damp kind of cold. There's moisture in the air that goes along with the cold. And I could understand it. It didn't help me, as I found out as I've gotten older. It hasn't helped my joints because I have arthritis, and I had juvenile arthritis at the time as a young person delivering papers in Illinois. But still, it seemed like it was something that I could understand. It was just achy joints. Don't be concerned about it.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that physically impacted me, because of visiting here in January, didn't make a determination if this was someplace to live, was the fact that it was a dry cold.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, my goodness, you don't get chilled to the bone. It just feels cold on your skin.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, all right, that is a plus. After all the different winters, after decades of Midwest damp winters, this was different. But I didn't realize that the physical cold of the state wasn't the only coldness that could be found here.
Mm-hmm. So what's the other coldness you found?
Oh, that would be the Minnesota nice cold.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that's the cold that takes and places you at arm's length and basically says it's okay for you to make some strides to increase in society. And I said some.
Mm-hmm.
But don't get too close as you're increasing your value socially. So
Mm-hmm.
the Minnesota cold aspect of how it is that people of color get treated bled over into what I'll call dark interaction.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered as I arrived here and I got to see more people of color, why it is and how it would be possible that people of color didn't recognize each other here.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried to understand, do people think that you want what they've accumulated while being here? What in the heck is going on? And as usual, I never wanted anything of material value. I figure from other people, I figure out that I can earn.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that we were taught. You want it, earn it. Never take anything from anybody. It even got to a point of you can't even accept social welfare if it got down to that point, and you just figured a way to work your way through it. So I didn't understand why people were closed off. People of color were closed off here.
Mm-hmm.
I understood that there's a narrative, and learned that early, as far as whites in the state were concerned, that basically said, we can lay claim to this part of the world, you can't. And especially as far as the state is concerned, this is our state, and we'll make room for you here with allowances.
Mm-hmm.
And I never quite fully captured what those unspoken tenets were, the meanings that folks had about how life was going to be lived here. I had to actually live through the experience long enough. So I consider myself an Illinoisan who is on an extended visit
hmm
to Minnesota, and I've been here for over 40 years.
Right. And a lot of that was in Plymouth, right?
It was suburban. There wasn't very much time spent in the cities. I
Mm-hmm.
had different places that I'd lived in different parts of Minneapolis. None in that's not true. There was actually a place in St. Paul also that was in a residential area that I had rented. And it was close to Dinkytown, close enough to Dinkytown, because I
Mm-hmm.
managed at the Dinkytown McDonald's.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a connection with the university, trying to make certain that I knew that even though I hadn't registered to become a University of Minnesota student yet, I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
have some kind of connection with the school.
Yeah.
So yes, most of my life in the Twin Cities, interestingly enough, has been more suburban life.
Mm-hmm.
And it even had a point in time that I remember driving out in this area that I live in now, and there was hardly anything here. And I remember at one point driving through Plymouth to get to work in Bloomington, and I checked the clock for how long it would take before I would see another dark face like mine on the roads.
Mm-hmm.
And it took half an hour.
Yeah.
And I thought, where the heck am I? I couldn't wrap my head around what is this place. I would still remember going back to Chicago on one of my motorcycles.
mm-hmm.
And I was riding down the street with my niece, and one of my nieces on the back of the bike. And as we were riding down the street, I was waving to black people, and they were waving back.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, "You're a fool." I said, "You don't understand. I am so hungry for people right now, genuine people,
Mm-hmm.
because I had been starved, basically, for humane contact in this state."
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, whatever your diet is, wherever you are, you adjust, you adapt to that diet. So I've adjusted and I've adapted to, there's going to be lukewarm folks. There's going to be folks that are crazy hot about you being around. And there's going
Mm-hmm.
to be a lot of cold folks, because this, after all, is Minnesota.
Right. Well, how did you make that work with becoming? And I think when I interviewed your daughter, she mentioned you were the first black principal in Champlin. Is that right?
That we had the first black principal.
Mm-hmm.
And she was actually from Bloomington.
Okay.
Part Zimbabwean, part Minnesotan.
Mm-hmm.
So she's mixed. And now she is the superintendent in Hopkins School District.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
And there's Rhoda Mary Perry Reed,
Mm-hmm.
one of the most intellectually fabulous. I'm trying my best to find the right adjectives to make it understood who this person is. And it's very difficult to get it expressed.
Mm-hmm.
There was one thing for certain: she was too bright for our school. Even as our principal, she had expectations that exceeded what could be expected in an Anoka-Hennepin school, in the Anoka-Hennepin school district, ended up leaving and going to get her doctorate. Been to school at Harvard, so she got a degree at Harvard, got a degree at Princeton, I believe, was the latest degree to get her doctorate, or it was the other way around, and it was Princeton undergrad, Harvard graduate. But she's Dr. Reed. That's one thing that you get to know for certain. Somebody that you know that you can relaxedly talk with, while at the same time understanding there's a mind working here that goes beyond most constructs, most people's understanding about how to view given situations in the world in different ways than people have thought about it before. So we had, yes, and even with that, she was interviewing to get the job as our principal in our district or in our building against one of the black teachers that helped start Champlain Park back in '92, and that's Willie Jett. So he was there starting the building with me, and whenever as he was going through his journey away from Champlain, and he would encounter students that were at school at Champlain, he would say, "Tell the other black man I said hello." Because it was the two of us for a while.
Right.
Tell the other black man I said hello.
Right. Can you tell me more about starting the building and your role in that and your role teaching in Champlain?
Being out in the suburbs, first and foremost, becoming an educator in the building, I had a consideration boiled down to two different districts that I could choose from. And I said I could choose. And it was between the Anoka-Hennepin School District and Hopkins School District. Now, I have to take us back a little bit away to being in the Anoka-Hennepin school area as a business person. So this is as a restaurant manager at a place called Rack's Roast Beef, which was a competitor to Arby's.
Oh, okay.
And I had my position in Anoka. So I was there as this restaurant manager. One of the pluses I had was meeting who was going to become my roommate, a gentleman from Cuba who is a black Cuban who became this Cuban Buddhist as my roommate. He was into what I call New Age Buddhism. Roberto Fonts. And Roberto and I had such a similar view about, and still do to this day, about how it is that we're going to look at life and people in the world as an overall perspective, how it is that we could deal with this. So that was a positive that I received from working out in Anoka at that time. One of the negatives got me to a point where I had to tell my supervising manager that I didn't feel safe in Anoka any longer. And again, this was back in the early 1980s, and I would like a transfer to a different store. And he branded me my transfer and sent me over to Roseville, which was more diverse. And I was coming to understand that how conservative that area in the cities actually was at that point in time.
Hmm. So you said you asked for the transfer because you didn't feel safe. Was there a particular incident that happened?
It wasn't even anything overt. It was
Hmm.
just, I guess you would call it, kind of like a black radar, that something wasn't right. Something was off about being there. And something was going to happen if I remained there much longer. So there
Hmm.
was more a feeling of what was taking place in and around the store, in that area of the store. One of the things that helped me understand what people's mindsets were like, I answered a drive-through order,
Hmm.
and when the car pulled up, there was this woman and her child. She was in the front, the child was in the back. The child couldn't have been any more than about 7 or 8 years old. And as I was collecting money for the order, the child looked out from under in the back seat and said, "You don't look like what you sound like back there."
Mm.
And I thought, okay, kids got some preconceived notions about what all black people are like,
Right.
and how did they arrive at that point at such an early age as far as I was concerned.
Hmm.
Well, it helped me understand these are some folks who have, to put it politically correct, conservative views about ways it is that they're going to see people.
Hmm.
So moving forward then to becoming an educator, where it is that I would end up,
Hmm.
and having gone through the program, the Alternative for Licensure program in Anoka Hennepin in connection with St. Cloud State, I thought if I was going to make any particular impact, something that would possibly matter, it would be at the Anoka Hennepin School District rather than Hopkins, because Hopkins was already known to be a more progressive, forward-thinking district.
Hmm.
So there wouldn't have been much needle moving going on in Hopkins. It would be almost an expectation. You're coming in, you're not going to be the same. We don't want status quo. We want different. Welcome.
Right.
Which
Right.
would have felt awfully good
Hmm.
considering the two. But that wasn't where the activist in me was definitely at that point in my life. One of the
Hmm.
things that my brother said to me a few years back was that, and it struck me awfully hard, because we grew up in Decatur, Illinois, as I mentioned, and most people, when they hear that, they think, Midwestern town, Central Illinois.
Hmm.
What was it like? Well, during the time that we were there, it was economically booming.
Hmm.
Uh, the distress that was about the town is how southern it is.
Hmm.
You would think it was Decatur, Georgia, Decatur, Alabama, Decatur, Arkansas. If you called, and I had done it a few times where you would call and you would talk with an operator, speak with an operator, and this
Hmm.
person with this heavy southern accent would answer the phone, and I'd ask, "Is this Decatur, Illinois?" And they say, "Yes, sir, it is," with this very heavy southern accent.
Yeah.
And I said, "Oh my goodness!" And I every now and then, early on being here in Minnesota, people would say, when you get tired, there's this drawl that will come out. I'm like, oh no. I brought some of Decatur with me. You would not
Hmm.
believe how southern exposed this doggone town is. Now it's
Yeah.
really economically destroyed, but it was at that point in time that I was there, manufacturing processing city, of 100,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
It's somewhat less now, but it's considered to be around about that amount. The places that were the little towns that were around it are more economically advanced than Decatur is. It's so depressed at the present.
Okay.
So out of this place, we grew up viewing our lives as best as we could. And we grew up poor, and I have a sister that says we weren't poor. I've seen poor. Well, she saw destitute. Destitute in comparison to our poor, because we had the house that had basically 3 rooms in it, a wood burning stove in the middle of the large room that wound up being a multi-use room, one line of water coming into the house that was cold water, an outhouse. We didn't even have any indoor plumbing besides that one line of water that came into the house in the kitchen. So we had to draw our water and heat it on that wood burning, coal burning stove in the middle of the room that heated the house. We had bath day. So there was a metal tub, portable metal tub that you would take your bath in, and the water get poured out, and the next person would get their bath water heated up and put into the tub type of thing. We had a root cellar, so you went outside the house, go down into the root cellar. And this place, I mean, for all intents and purposes, people would look at it, and if I had taken a picture of it at the time, they would have believed that it was someplace from the South.
Right.
And this was a place in Decatur, Illinois. We even had a dirt road in front of our house. It wasn't even paved.
Wow. Yeah.
For years, our dogs would lay out in the dirt road, and people knew it was our house because they would see our dogs. It's like, oh, it's the Sanders dogs. We know, we were told about these guys. Good pups, they wouldn't harm anybody. They didn't really protect the place. They just barked at people like, hi, welcome to our house type of barking. And I didn't realize why it was that we moved, because I lived in that house for 7 years of my life, and I'm the last of 6. And we wound up moving to a different part of Decatur when I was 8. And it come to find out that it was because the city had bought property to put a water treatment plant on.
Oh.
Anytime you ask a question, I should start out with, let me tell you a story, because it'll take a while and it does meander. But there's so many details that make up getting to my being even at Champlin as a teacher.
Right.
There's a backstory that says basically you've seen stuff that most people haven't seen or experienced that would make you do something that most people wouldn't do possibly. Take the hard route rather than the simple route. So out of what we had as parents, even that isn't as simple as a lot of folks might consider. Being in this house in Decatur, Illinois, I can't call it a shack because it was too much like home, and we were family rich, but we weren't economically wealthy.
Right.
We were never dirty. We were never hungry. We didn't go without shoes. Lake Decatur wasn't that far from where we lived, so we had a chance to walk down to the lake, a man-made lake. It was right there. It was available. So it was rural living. It was country living.
Right. So maybe Champlin wasn't that scary for you.
Oh, please. So we had my mother and father that came out of Oklahoma, and they came from rural Oklahoma. So these are rural folks that moved from Oklahoma rural to Illinois rural. So it wasn't difficult for them to make an adjustment.
Right.
My pops made it through 8th grade, and then went to work. Moms made it through 4th grade, and then went to work. So once I got to 9th grade in high school, I had surpassed my folks in education. We wound up becoming a part of eminent domain for the city, which meant that they wanted the land that we were on to use to do water, put in a water treatment plant. So that's how we ended up getting bought out and moving to another neighborhood, which meant that I switched schools. Out of the 6 children that they had for these 2 folks, with as limited amount of formal education as they had. 5 of us have post-high school educations. 4 of us have 4-year degrees, and my brother and I have master's degrees. So 5/6 of us made it. And I say that because it's not where you come from. It's where you believe you can go. And we were never given an idea that we had limits. It was the oddest thing you would expect, that somebody who is fiscally, economically poor would see that there are limits all over the place, but we were never given an idea whatsoever that we ever had limits. So we could go and learn. And one of us that had passed away a few years ago, one of us that had a 4-year degree was in journalism, and she was proven to be clinically mentally ill. So there are those that would even say, well, you guys must have all been brilliant to be able to pull yourselves past that point. No, we just didn't believe that we had limits. We weren't shown or taught or given a fact that we were limited.
Right.
We could do as much as we could do and keep doing more if we chose. So this was a kind of backdrop. Formal education-wise, going through the first few years of elementary school, so leaving my previous teachers, who to me were the best on the entire planet because of what they instilled in me. And my original teachers, of course, were my parents. And it was not a simple life, to say the least. It was a meaningful life, every day, every step of the way. From getting my education from them to going to formal education, I sensed that something was not the same. And that would have been in the early 60s. So we were just in the shadow of Brown, changing over how schools were going to be taught and where it was that our children were going to go to school. There was something disconnected between how my kindergarten teacher taught me for half a day and how I was taught the previous 4 years by my parents.
Do you feel like those, oh, sorry.
Go right ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, do you feel like that translated to your teaching style in Champlin, and how did
yes,
students,
indeed. Yes.
and how did your
And this
students
is why it
respond
is
to
that
you?
I'm going back to this phase, because I had teachers that seemed like they were trying to do well by us, but not necessarily doing all that well for us.
Right.
So we we were getting an education to a degree. And all I could think of as I was growing in Decatur was how was it that I was going to get out of Decatur. That was my whole reason to be. I had to escape the place by hook or crook. And one of the things that people didn't or still don't understand or realize about where Decatur is situated, it's about equal distance about between Chicago and St. Louis.
Okay.
So you had people or have people who would make connections in Decatur that were the Chicago illegal folks and the St. Louis illegal folks, and they would do their dealings in Decatur. So they wouldn't have to make the whole trip one way or the other. So it was a stop-off point between there and St. Springfield, which is the state capital. So if there were guns and drugs or anything of the sort, these rural towns, cities, were their stop-off places. And we saw some of what their dealings were and so forth, but we didn't get caught up in it. We were too busy growing up there to leave, basically. Even as a 10th grader in high school, I had gotten to a point where I felt as though I had been told enough half-truths. There were some things as far as information was concerned to me that were being held back, some aspects of my education that wasn't complete, and I decided I was dropping out. And the only thing that kept me going as far as school was concerned was the first question I asked myself: when you drop out, where are you going to live? Well, Mom and Dad aren't going to allow you to stay in their house under their roof without getting an education. So what are you going to do? Well, I'll find some place else to live. Well, how are you going to pay for that? I'll lie to the people at the processing plants or something and tell them I'm older than I am and see about getting a job, and that'll help pay my bills. How are you going to get out of Decatur? Kind of got stumped there. All right, you were thinking about the NFL. Yeah, I'll go to the NFL. Do you think that they've got NFL scouts that go through factories looking for football players?
Right.
Well, no, they don't. They look for them coming out of the colleges. Bingo. So you got no choice. You got to go to school. And that's where an idea of going to either USC, Southern California, or Ohio State came to mind. And I ended up at Ohio State and Mizzou, as I mentioned before. So now we got kind of a backdrop for a mindset of what education could mean to me from what it is that I had as formal education of my own. Going into Champlin, I interviewed for with a number of people. It seemed like there were a dozen people in that room. There may not have been that many. It may have only been about 6 or 8, but it seemed like there was a dozen folks in that room. And I got to a point, I had done interviewing before in case I wanted to go get out of sales at one place and go into work somewhere else. I wanted to know how to interview, and I read the book Knock 'em Dead, did some research, and it even said go on interviews just so that you could get used to the idea of interviewing for jobs, even though you may not accept those jobs. I think, okay, this makes sense, and I did that. So as I sat down for that interview, and I talked with those teachers and administrators in the interview, I came up with a question that one of my future colleagues looked at one of the administrators and asked, can he ask that? And the administrator looked at her and said, he just did. Like, now give him an answer. So
Mhm.
I had taken them aback. They wanted me at Champlin. I wanted me in the Anoka Hennepin School District to see if I could do what my brother said didn't happen in most white households. He said they don't have to think about us.
Right.
And I thought about what he said, and I said, so what you're saying is anytime any one of them brings up Kaepernick, it's just a topic of discussion. It doesn't really have any meaning to them.
Mhm.
And he said, yep, that'd be pretty much the way of it. It's like,
Mhm.
holy crap. And I said,
Right.
okay, I've got this for you. I'm in those homes. I'm part of the discussions and I'm part of the thoughts because I have people that come in to me who are either upset or they have questions because of something that I said in class.
Mhm.
So it's not just a matter of my being the black man in the building. I'm also a dark person in their homes.
Mhm. Right.
So
So,
it was
yeah.
a history with that particular region, that area of the Twin Cities, and trying my best to get people to think on a broader basis meant a
Mhm.
lot more to me than just being an accepted teacher in another suburb in the cities, which would
Yeah.
very likely be viewed as just another suburb because it's already considered to be more progressive than many other suburbs.
Right. And I think that kind of summed up what my last question was going to be to you, but and maybe you have something else or something different, but what would you want people to take away from your experience being a black person living and working in the suburbs of Minnesota? Like, what would
One
you
of
want
the
people
things
to know?
that folks uh, are really on a consistent basis, especially dark people, are really concerned with is trying our best to be activated, to try to figure out how do we make a difference in the narrative that's a white narrative. And
Mhm.
there's an understanding that there is a white narrative, and I'll even call it a white myth or a myth of whiteness that is a part of being in America.
Mhm.
Part of the distress with that myth and that narrative is it's repeated day in and day out to everybody's child, no matter what they look like, and it's called the educational curriculum. It has
Mhm.
its direction. It has its understanding about what it's going to mean for you to be a citizen in these United States of America. And when you get the diploma, it has an underlying statement. Now you're ready to understand the Great White Way.
Mhm.
Now there's not a whole lot of folks that would look at that consideration. And because of it, there's different ways that different people get taught in the cities or in education in the United States. So,
Mhm.
and one reason why I say the cities is because the state in and of itself is the second most economically distant, this, with an economic disparity between blacks and whites in the
Mhm.
50 United States. This is number 2.
Right.
Number 1 is right next door in Wisconsin. Now, how is
Mhm.
that possible? And if
Mhm.
you take a look at what the population set is, there's an incredibly large white population and not a very large non-white population between the two states.
Right.
So you wind up having folks who don't understand how this myth continues to be directed, how it doesn't seem like there's any way that it stops or even gets altered. My concern when we demonstrate, and we have, now I've seen demonstrations since the 60s when they're talking about definitely the movement at that time and trying our best to just get some social rights and economic rights and housing rights and living through it and watching the violence that went against people who looked like me. As I sat on the floor watching TV and looking over my shoulder at the door, wondering if those people were going to break down the door and come after me because I looked like the people who were being physically destroyed on television.
Mm-hmm.
Having that kind of view of a world that basically says you're irrelevant here, taking it and changing that narrative, at least skewing the narrative to a point where there needs to be a view of inclusion. That's where education comes in, and that's where it is that educators of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, so the BIPOC folks, the ones that have been marginalized so much in so many different ways, where the narrative, the definitive narrative, can be broken down, can be studied, can be viewed for what it is as a narrative, and that there are more sides to any given story than has been presented. So as far as being an educator of color is concerned, that is to me, one of the biggest and greatest benefits, going beyond just, not even saying that it's any less, because it has proven to be incredibly important to be one of the folks in the streets that is railing against the system,
Mm-hmm.
to also get inside of part of the system that says basically that you're irrelevant and say, I do matter. And this is how it is that I matter. My story matters. The views that I bring with me matters. The people who look like me or anything near similar to me matter. Everything that has been not discussed, everything that has been ignored, and where the ignorance comes in, all of that can be altered by having educators of color in places where I can guarantee we're unwanted. For the longest time, I had people trying their best to figure out some kind of way to get me out of the building.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, I've apparently worn them down because I don't hear as much noise about what it is that I'm not doing that they want me to do.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, being as much or as close to a white teacher as they would like or prefer for me to be.
Mm-hmm.
So I can go on about the business of giving different views, giving different sides, helping their children become more critical thinkers rather than just reaction people who react to what it is that they've been taught and trained, not even taught, trained to believe in their household. And that's another thing as far as people of color are concerned, the dark folks, if we can just figure out some way, and this is another one of those critical thinking considerations, if we can figure out some way to write our own narrative, where we are the heroes, where we are the ones that are the preferred ones, where we are the ones that have power, where we are the ones, where it becomes definite about who and what it is that we mean to us together as a collective. and not just react to the white narrative, because it keeps becoming reactionary rather than actions taken to promote ourselves.
Right. And I think that really is kind of at the center of, what we're trying to do with this interview. So I really do appreciate your time today and you sharing your story with us. Yeah. So if you're comfortable, I was gonna stop there and then also just be in contact with you via email about how we tend to move forward with the interviews and then the how we're gonna store them and where we're gonna store them and everything like that.
Well, Jojo, if I could just leave you with a couple of my writings, because this is one of the ways that I try to process what is going on in life to me as I see it. I wrote what was known as an ode to George Floyd. And the reason why I wound up writing this ode is because my daughters were going with their friends down to the last site where he took his last breath. And on that particular day they were down there, the rioting was starting. So the demonstrations were underway and the riots were getting ready to amp up. It hadn't happened as of yet. And she asked, do you have something that you want us to read at the site? And I said, and she said, you don't have to. It's just if you want to. And I had to get this particular perspective out of my system. So it's titled An Ode to George Floyd. What does this death mean? Far more than words placed at the scene, much more than the space and place and time, far more than our senses. Because it's left some blind with rage that needs to be released, an explosion due to the crimes called from the blood, sweat, and tears for what's happened to a people dragged across an ocean, all shed for so long for being made into a hue, H-U-E, man, assigned a color and a lowered place in a society in which makes it difficult. This person forced down in a way no one should, was in no understandable way, was denied his life as well as his personhood, was proven a part of someone else's plan that was placed in a document that said, you are less than a whole man. In a place where celebrations about dark people are all connected to our collective body, where if you can entertain the masses, then your life is not considered shoddy. If you can work for us and grow our food and build, you may wake up tomorrow and not find yourself killed. These streets can become grounds for any of us to be forced down, to be filled with packs of lies and told we can never gain the prize, to help us understand the myth and never the reality that on other shores than this, we were kings and queens and lived and thrived on all the lands as far as we could see. So the truth is we are more than color, more than bodies for labor. We are hearts. We are hopes. We are dreams. We are everything that makes our lives something valued and valuable to savor. We are beauty. We are strength. And above all, we are resilient. Every quality, every nuance, power that has ever been dreamed come together in a gift called presence, where every life is spent. In these ways, we are connected to this life, not long ago taken, that says we are one in fact, that our truths in life aren't shaken. You have left us, George Floyd, but in your death you did not fail by the way your life was stolen. In our ways, we'll give them hell. And that was what it is that's considered my ode to George Floyd. I had a watermark behind that writing that says Black Lives Matter more. And some people would question, well, how is that supposed to be? And if you ever say Black Lives Matter, And the way that I think, which is a zero-sum game, it means that if your life matters, mine doesn't. And that's not what the statement is. And it's known and it's understood that's not what the statement is. You just want to view it that way, basically, so that you can say you're trying to take away. You're not trying to take, trying to add to. Just like I said about Minnesotans and dark Minnesotans when I first got here. Seemed like they were expecting that I was trying to take something, and I didn't want to take anything. I wanted to find who they were. This is a rant that I gave to my friends, and this is the one where Black Lives Matter more than we've been receiving credit for, more than is understood in the making of this country, more than whites realize how we've nurtured their lives, more than being willing to just fold and slink away for over 500, 400 years of oppression on this side of the world after being dragged from our motherland, raped, abused, and forced to labor for something so heartless, vile, and evil that's designated itself white man, more than the paltry history that's been written about us as a defeated, childlike people, more than any depiction we've been proffered in a white man's narrative. More, 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 more.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for reading that, and, having that be part of the record. So thank you.